What's up, guys? Today, we are going to be talking about the French Revolution. We're going to be doing a discussion segment. My name's Trent Scotty. I'm the host of Plush Revolution, and I'm joined here with Scotty.
Scotty Garner. My name is Scotty Garner. I have my own channel where it's kind of multifaceted. I talk about psychology and history, and I also really like music. But yeah, I am at school here at both of us.
Yes, we are.
As you can see on his jacket, OU.
University.
And I'm studying to be a historian. I would call myself a historian at this point.
I agree.
And so, yeah, this is going to be my first history video on my channel, and it's going to be an overview of the French Revolution.
Yes. So we're actually gonna post this on both channels. So go subscribe to Scotty if you're watching this from my channel, and you can subscribe to me if you're watching from his channel. So we're gonna get started with the French Revolution. So I guess I'm just gonna start by kind of setting the stage. So these are some bullet points, just kind of like different sections we're gonna be talking about. So we're gonna start with the 7 Years' War because it's like, where do you start? We're gonna start with the 7 Years' War that made the most sense to start. So we have this slide here. So I'm just going to be kind of laying the foundation, kind of put our minds back in 1750, which is obviously the revolution doesn't break out till 1789, but we're about 30 years before. So a major event takes place in the 1750s called the 7 Years' War. And this is a conflict that actually takes place in the Americas and is a huge shift of power in France. So just kind of an idea where France is at this point. So France had been a monarchy for centuries at this point. They're ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, which started with Louis the 13th's father, who was Henri the Fourth back in the year 1589. That's how long the Bourbons have been in power. And so under Louis the 13th, who I just previously mentioned, the country became an absolute monarchy, and then his son ended up ruling for 72 years as the Sun King, Louis the 14th. So now, at this time, you have the next monarch, Louis the 15th, who's on the throne. And so they've been ruling absolutely. Another thing to note about France is they're a very strongly Catholic nation. And so their Catholicism roots play a huge part in how they govern. So this is a little bit of a slide I'd like to show you guys about the kind of the social class structure of France at the time. So as you can see, France is divided into three estates. So the first estate is the clergy, which are pretty much church leaders and things like that. The second estate, we have the nobility. So these are inherited titles that's passed down through families. They own, they collect taxation, they own land out in the countryside and own peasants and things like that. And both the clergy and the nobility they only make up 3% of the population combined, which is nothing. And so they're actually exempted from many things like taxation. They don't get taxed. So that's a huge thing. So they have a huge edge in the population, and a lot of their positions are just inherited. And then you have 97% of the population, which is the third estate, which includes the artisans, peasants, and the new bourgeoisie class, which is actually what we would probably consider today middle class. These are your lawyers. These are your people that they're your educated individuals of the third estate, which do exist at the time. So they are considered part of the third estate as well. So France at this time is one of the most powerful countries on earth. And so we see this in America with this map here. So as you can see, Canada and most of the United States is occupied by the French at this time. So they are not only an empire in Europe, but they're also an empire in America. They're a colonial empire. And so they're controlling most of North America at this time, even more than Britain, which is very interesting. They also have a few colonies in the Caribbean as well. So what happens is in 1754, they go to war against Britain in the 7 Years' War, which we just talked about. We'll go back up to it right here. So they go to war against Britain, and the French actually end up losing that war. And so they cede all of their territory in America to the British. And so the French are kicked out of America. And it's starting really at this point. The monarchy starts to become unpopular with the people. They start to lose a lot of their authority abroad. And if we go back to the social structure, as you can see, 97% of the population, when you get a majority of them rallying against these 3%, they can't do a whole lot because this is the majority of the population. So there's so many people on their side. And we're going to see that later on in 1789. But France goes to war against Britain. They lose. And then the monarchy starts to become very unpopular. And a few years later, Louis XV dies. He passed the throne on to his grandson, Louis XVI, because his father had died before his grandfather did. And so that kind of leaves us with kind of a new order in the world. And France is just going to keep going downhill from this point forward. So it's not looking too good after the 7 Years' War, and that's a big factor to starting the revolution. So we'll let Scotty continue with the retrospect.
So one note that I'll add on to what he said, he mentioned that there's a new bureaucracy, which will be very important, and I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Yes.
But one thing that's also useful to note is just a broad historical point, is most of the people who lived throughout history were farmers. So 97% of these people were farmers, and they were essential for the upper class. So it's not, they all relied on each other. But that's just an important note. Even that's very different after the Industrial Revolution where we are today, where there's not as many farmers. And farmers are much more a minority, whereas most of history, that 97%, a lot of those people, they were farmers. Just a little side note that's kind of useful to know.
For sure.
So we're going to go to 1754 here, and we're going to talk about the Virginian colonies, which we now know as America, obviously. But I'm going to kind of utilize what we're doing here is setting up the stage for the French Revolution. And I look at, in retrospect, what happened in 1754 in the Virginian colonies with the Virginians rising up against I look at it as a microcosm of the French Revolution. And so 1754, he set the stage. We have Europe, and then on the other side, in the Virginian colonies, we have this battle between lower class and upper class going on. And in the Virginian colonies, in the Ohio River Valley, basically what's going on right now is this is happening. You have George Washington, who in this case we're going to use as an analogy to represent this lower class, the Brits, who essentially this is what he described has been happening, and they finally decide this warrior mode triggers on. All right, we're not going to put up with this taxation any longer. We want our fair share, and so they rise up. George Washington goes to Robert Dinwiddie and collects his people and talks to General Braddock, and he's like, all right, we're going to go and attack a French encampment. And so George Washington goes and attacks this French encampment, which is Fort Duquesne, which is near modern-day Pittsburgh. So he gathers his militia up, and this starts a series of battles in which Pennsylvania frontier near this Susquehanna River, hopefully I get the pronunciations right. And unfortunately, all of this, the series of battles leads in essentially with broad brush, like going over a handful of details because we're focusing on the French Revolution here. Edward Braddock, unfortunately, on the British side, suffers a devastating defeat that is very embarrassing. And this is at Fort Necessity, and this basically sets the stage for what will later happen in France, where the French follow in the lead here, and they do a similar thing. So,
all right, I guess I'll take with the next one. So I want to talk about some of the New World revolutions. So this is our last slide covering the kind of the precursor and the last of background information before we get into the revolution. Because you can't really understand the French Revolution without understanding what comes before it. So at this time, before the French Revolution, we see a lot going on. And we already talked about what happened in their colonies. France lost their colonies in the 1760s. Later on in the Caribbean, they have a colony in Haiti. And I wanted to bring this up because this is really interesting. Haiti has a revolution around the late 18th century. It's actually a slave uprising. The slave population of Haiti rises up against the French authorities and actually takes over the government in a coup. And France loses their colonies in the Caribbean. So they are completely out of the Western Hemisphere for now until Napoleon gets it back later. But for now. And so we start to see what Scotty kind of alluded to. We start to see things like in America, we start to see the British colonies declare independence. We start to see the American Revolution come along. And the French were a huge part in helping that because they kind of wanted to get their revenge on the British. So it was kind of like enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing. And so it was like the French government is helping the Americans fight for a republic and a democracy, yet they're a monarchy. So it was kind of interesting. And so it's like you kind of think looking back, the French were blind to this fact that once their people see that they're helping America, that yeah, anyway, that's just something interesting. So that happens, and the French play a huge part in the American Revolution. And in fact, Marquis de Lafayette, who was one of the French main commanders in the war, and the French are part of the reason the Americans even won that war against the British, huge part. Marquis de Lafayette and actually Thomas Jefferson actually end up both drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man in 1789, which is the document that is first published in France to kind of tell everybody that this is the Enlightenment, this is what democracy looks like. And so that's kind of a big thing here. And we also see things with the Dutch Habsburg states. And this is a time, we're in the late 1700s, the Enlightenment's in full swing. People are starting to questioning things like government, religion, all this stuff that had never really been thought about before in the Middle Ages. And we're trying to, it's almost as if it's like a mini Renaissance going on at this time period. And so this is really going to play in a big part in France because people are going to see what happened in America. They're going to see what happened in Haiti and all these places. And they're going to be like, wait a minute, why can't we do this the same because we are being suppressed by our government? So that's a big part of it. So I'll let Scotty take it away with this next part.
Yes. So, and I'm going to kind of talk about some things here before I go into details with this map. Here, I'll move over to this map, which you kind of can't really tell in the video. You can't really see. But I'll be able to put it on diagram here. So, because I myself was confused, I'm going to clear this up before I go into we start talking about the French Revolution. Prussia here, which is this, I'll highlight it on my video on my end when I show, but Prussia is right here, this little tiny like blue area.
Northeast Germany.
Yes,
kind of area.
Which Prussia right now, where Prussia is now, is it doesn't exist anymore. Now what's there is Germany, and we have Prussia at the time becomes distributed amongst Poland, which still does exist, and Russia as well, and basically, so like I'm just clearing that up because people who aren't familiar with like what Prussia even is would maybe have questions. Now it's Germany essentially. So I just wanted to mention that because we're going to talk about the Habsburgs and we're going to talk about, and these are now Germany. So
Yep.
The people within Germany, those people still exist. Like you still have the Celtics and you still have the Habsburgs and stuff like that, but it's not, there's no Prussian identity. It's just Austrian blood now. And it's the different fractured versions of it, which there's a lot of them. But let's begin with actually, now that we've set the stage, let's talk about the French Revolution. And a lot of what he talked about, a lot of what he mentioned with, so basically, it's overgeneralizing, but it's useful to kind of sometimes do that because there's a lot more things happening in the details. But what is essentially going on here is, like he said, a renaissance, a little mini renaissance is occurring, and you're getting a lower class is rising up against the upper class. And we've created since then, although they might have had names for them at the time. I don't actually know. It's a good question. But now we call these things the Enlightenment, and within the Enlightenment, you had thinking such as republicanism. Republicanism is one new philosophy that develops, and you also had Enlightenment and republicanism, which is essentially just this questioning of authority, is essentially what happens. And so the lower class develops its own kind of politics, which is a new kind of thing, and starts to question the Catholic Church first and foremost. And then it starts to question the monarchy because it's not getting its fair share, I guess you could say, even though some people modern day would regard that as an overgeneralization. I think it's useful to set the stage. And so basically what's going on? Well, Louis XVI marries Mary Antoinette, who is who was of the Habsburg Empire. And basically everything I said happens, and they are unable to provide to the lower class. And so representing the lower class, a bourgeoisie group of bureaucrats, in the midst of this happening, is locked out of, and here I want to zoom in here, French bourgeoisie are locked out of their meeting hall, which is like their town hall where they would discuss what laws and things to do, on 1789 of June 20th. And this was anticipated that they just knew it was going to happen, and they have we call this moment the tennis court oath. These people decide officially. They go to a nearby tennis court and they decide, we are going to rebel. We're going to rebel against the monarchy. And so they make a plan at the tennis courts here on this day in 1789, June 20th, to rise up. And so they're going to create their own constitution, essentially. And so the first rebellious groups emerge within France. And they take the Bastille Fortress on July 14th, which is a war barracks, by force. And then the aristocrats that we mentioned before with the tennis court oath, they meet again, and they decide that essentially feudal society is what they deem. Middle age, like monarchical versus like the serfs, the lower class. This is coming to an end. They officially established that. And so there's a lot that happens. Essentially what happens here is civil war, like what we saw in the American Revolution. And we'll go into details about how it's different. It is different to the American Revolution in many ways, which Napoleon Bonaparte attempts to solve later on. But essentially, civil war happens. There's a lot of violence, over 17,000 to 14,000 people, which for France, you look at France on the map that I showed earlier, it's a small area. So that's a lot of people in that area, especially for the time. 17,000 to 14,000 people die as a result of this civil war. And one other interesting note before the French Revolution eventually starts to go crazy, and it really is in full civil war, full force. Is there's this famous event where their equivalent of the White House, they have their White House, women go and very, very violently revolt. And they search for the king, and they search for the queen, and demand that the king and the queen run away and stuff like that. And in the midst of all of this, basically what ends up happening, despite that they were demanded to leave, they still capture the king and queen anyways. They get caught in their attempts to flee. So in 1793, all of these things are happening, and then in 1793, France is declared a republic. And Louis XVI is executed via guillotine. And this spurs what happens next, which is the guillotine genocides.
Yeah. So I'll add a little bit to that. So part of the reason a lot of the people rise up and start to storm these places is because the people of the country are starving at this time. France has put in heavy taxation on the people, and things that they've been involved with, like the American Revolution, have caused the country to go broke. And so in Louis XVI, I think he's one of these guys, and it's hard to say for sure, but he was one of those kings that just didn't really feel like he enjoyed the job too much. And he was definitely not the best ruler France had ever had. And he started to lose a lot of popularity. And the original goal was, let's not kill the king. Let's try to get the king to kind of allow us to kind of have a little bit more power. So he calls the Estates General in for the first time since 1614. Which they didn't really have any power. They just kind of recommended something to the king because the king's like, I don't know what to do. And so this happens, and so he's kind of like all this stuff, and then the people come in, they're starving. And that's where we get like the famous myth where Marie Antoinette says, let them eat cake. She probably never said that. But the reason we say that is because that goes to show what her attitude was toward those people. She's like, Madame, there's everybody's out there starving. Well, let them eat cake. So she's kind of like, I don't really care. She's kind of like brushing it off. And so they tried to leave, and that only hurt them. And like he said, and so eventually the monarch starts to lose more power, and Austria and Prussia end up going to war against this new government that's going to be put in place to try to restore the monarchy. And so the people just kind of don't have a choice at this time. In order to erase all opposition to their cause, they need to kill him. That's the only way they're going to be able to do it. And so they pull out their new toy, the guillotine, that was just invented recently to execute Louis XIV. Then later on, or Louis XVI, sorry. Then later on, his wife. So that's kind of what happens. And so it's really bloody, like you said. So I'll get on to the next part. So I'm going to talk about what happens after this. So we kind of replace an authoritarian suppressive government with another authoritarian suppressive government. And you'll see how this went. So between the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, there's about a 10-year span, or about a 6-year span of absolute madness in France. And so the main movement was led by a guy named Maximilien Robespierre, Among other people, you have Georges Danton. You have Jean-Paul Marat. Jean-Paul Marat was actually the first guy to kind of come up with the idea of like anybody who doesn't support our cause will get executed, and that's going to be a major thing that happens. And so we get to what's called the Reign of Terror, which goes on at this time. So Robespierre, okay, so he's part of a bourgeoisie class. He grows up, he's part of the Third Estate. And so he joins a club called the Jacobin Club, which essentially they were all not in favor of the monarch. And so they're kind of the first big push to kind of overthrow the king and stuff like that. Robespierre establishes his decree, and so he kind of rules the country for a little bit, for about a year before he ends up dying himself. But he institutes a bunch of reforms. He's very anti-women's rights, as most people were at the time. He was very you speak out against the government. Well, he was very anti-speaking out against the government. And basically, if anybody were to speak out against the government, or if they were to be even basically just, if somebody thought they were just going to execute them. And so they ended up killing between 16,000 and 40,000 people in Paris alone during the Reign of Terror, which is absolutely insane when you think about those numbers. That's ridiculous. And so Robespierre does all this stuff. One of his colleagues, Marat, ends up getting assassinated in the bathtub. Some woman comes in and kills him. Craziness happens. And eventually Robespierre, he starts questioning, he creates a thing called the Cult of Reason, which is kind of questioning the religion in the country. And he actually establishes a brand new calendar in France, which gets rid of Sunday as a day. It gets rid of the year of our Lord and kind of creates a new system that is less religious. And so the Cult of Reason is kind of getting away from the church. So they kind of secede from the Catholic Church in that way. And also, if you tie that back into the monarchy, well, the whole reason why Louis XVI is king, well, that's because God gave him the authority to be king. And so they're trying to get rid of all of this religion stuff. And so it's part of so you have the Reign of Terror of the Committee of Public Safety is what it's called, and the Cult of Reason. And those are the three main things Robespierre establishes in his country, in France. But Robespierre becomes very unpopular with all the stuff that he's been doing, and so he ends up getting his head chopped off in 1794. So right after him, we get what's called the Directory, which was led by three bourgeoisie men. They kind of rule as the five directors. It's a very, very loose confederation. It's most of the governing of the country is based on local authorities. This time, they don't really solidify too much power. And that kind of segues into Napoleon coming out in a coup in November of 1799. Going back to Robespierre, I forgot to mention, when he was a kid, he actually gave a speech for Louis XVI when he was coming into town after his coronation, and Louis XVI didn't care much about what Robespierre had to say, and he was just kind of talking, congratulating the king and everything, and he worked really hard on that speech, and he was in law school at the time, and he was really upset about that, and he ended up making Louis XVI lose his head later down the line, which is really interesting. So that's Robespierre. With the ineffective government leads to the coup by Napoleon Bonaparte, which Scotty's going to take away. Take it away with this, Napoleon here.
So, yes, a lot of people... So, 2 points here. A lot of people typically... There's like a debate whether or not the French Revolution really does end here with the coup that he just mentioned. Or if it ends with the death of the life of Napoleon. Because a lot of what the French Revolution sought to do, this sort of secularization and this reason, and this sort of what America was trying to do, this sort of bringing in of freedom of expression and rights and speech, wasn't really established. Like if you think of things from a practical standpoint, if that was their goal, if that was the French Revolution's goal, was to bring in these freedoms, these reasons, these enlightenment, it didn't really practically look like these things were successfully achieved until far after that coup occurred. So, although you could argue that the French Revolution ended with the coup, I would extend to argue that in the same way that people say the Renaissance, for example, ended at the end of the Renaissance, some people argue that the Renaissance actually didn't end and still had far-reaching effects far after that. I argue, for example, the Baroque, although it came after the Renaissance, which was an art period, I argue that the Baroque was largely an extension of the Renaissance. It just took the Renaissance into more detail, into more greater heights. Same thing with Napoleon here. In my view, Napoleon, and I'll talk about I'll set the stage for Napoleon because he's been alive this whole time. This whole time we've been talking through all of this. So let's kind of talk about Napoleon. Napoleon was born. Let me see here. I want to get this exactly right. Well, I don't actually have the date.
1769.
Thank you.
I know this.
He was born in 1769. He died in 1821, which we'll get there. But he was a standout kid when he was little, like in his classes, and he was very much a predominant person. Like everyone who knew about him, they were well aware that he existed. But he had this weird obsession with Alexander the Great, starting at a young age, and he out of skipping a lot of details, just kind of focusing on the French Revolution aspect of him. He joined the military as soon as he could and rose the ranks like really fast. He showed like exceptional ability to lead in the military. And he spoke Corsican. Weirdly enough, some random facts about him. He spoke Corsican and Italian. He's in France. This guy's in France here. He spoke Corsican and Italian. He didn't start learning French until he was 10, which is kind of interesting. Which isn't super uncommon because again, like there was a lot of splintering. There was not only French people were in France, just like not only in Prussia, where there are only like one group of people. It's kind of different than America because in America, modern days, we all speak English, but like if you look at these European states, we'll have Prussia, they'll have Celtic people, and they'll have like Nordic people, have all these different groups of people, and so like there's lots of different languages in these European countries that lots of people speak different languages. But that's one thing. So that's an interesting fact about him. Another interesting fact about him, just as a side fact before I talk about the more French Revolution War things, is a lot of people think that he was short, which is actually a myth. He was 5'7", which for the time was actually the average height. So this myth that he was short is not true. It's false. And he was 5'7", which now we'd think of that as a little short, but and it's kind of funny that the story behind why that myth exists is actually a long-winded story that harkens back all the way back to the French Revolution. Napoleon Bonaparte, despite the fact that it seems that way because he has a very romanticized, like all these great military figures have a very romanticized history. Not everyone loved Napoleon. Not everybody, he had a cult following. I kind of compare him in my mind sort of to like maybe different politically and stuff, but like somebody like Trump or something where like a lot of people hated him, but he had a huge following of people enough to be a powerful leader and to have a lot of power. And that's just a little interesting note. But this guy goes and joins the military. He's kind of crazy. He's a crazy guy. He wants to be Alexander the Great. He's obsessed with Alexander the Great. And he kind of there's a lot of mythology around him. He kind of does succeed at doing something towards what Alexander the Great was doing. So in 1798, so this guy's risen through the ranks, and all these, basically, he embodies what the French Revolution is trying to do. And the reason we're talking about him is because although in practicality they seemed to establish their constitution, in society, these Enlightenment ideals, they weren't institutionalized. They weren't practiced. And so Napoleon, he's a figure who is a hallmark example of someone who seems to represent these changes in action. And so in 1790, let's talk about in 1798, he raids Egypt, to kind of extend my point of him being an Alexander the Great kind of inspired figure. It's kind of a silly little thing because he, in 1798, raids Egypt to get rich and conquer and disrupt access to India. And there's this whole thing because he mentioned far earlier how Britain and France are not friends. They are very much enemies. And Britain owns India right now. The British Empire is currently in reign right now, which is one of the three biggest empires. And basically, this guy is so crazy that he's like, I don't care that Britain owns India. We're going to try to interrupt that. This guy's thinking like Alexander the Great here. Mm-hmm. But it's kind of silly because he goes and raids, and he does successfully take Egypt, but it falls apart really fast. And he flees and goes back to France in order to protect his life. and has to hold and maintain, in classic kind of MAGA or like Elon style, he has to maintain this sort of front that he actually took Egypt, when in reality it's all falling apart behind, like, which, that's my understanding of it. And he comes back and they all have this perspective that he's totally taken over Egypt. Meanwhile, it's like in chaos and stuff like that. And so this all kind of leads up to the point, and there's a lot of details that I didn't talk about. I kind of talked about some broad things, but this all leads up to the point where he goes back to France, and that's this, he like has this high status because he did do a lot. He did go to Egypt. He did travel, and he's trying to bring these French ideals into being here. And so this following is enough for him to be declared consul by the people. And so that segues into you.
All
if
right.
you have anything to add to that, you can.
Yeah, so that's the rise of Napoleon. So basically, we're not going to go into too much details of the Napoleonic Wars. Basically, he took over most of Europe for a while, and eventually loses in 1812. He gets exiled in 1814, ends up dying in 1821 in his early 50s, I think. And so that was kind of the end of Napoleon. It was kind of a little era. And so this is the funniest part of the whole thing. Guess what they do after Napoleon's out? They bring back the monarchy. Yes, that's what they do. So they're like, I don't know what we can do now. And this was a big thing, because if you think about, why would they have done this? Because isn't that what the original goal was? Well, the thing is, the people that won the Napoleonic Wars are the monarchies of Europe. And so what they want to do is they want to restore the monarchy in France, because that's what they had been doing. That's what they had fought against during the French Revolution. So they restore the Bourbon dynasty. And Louis XVI's brother, Louis XVIII, is put on the throne. Why is he Louis XVIII? Well, because Louis XVII was a 10-year-old kid who died in prison during the Reign of Terror. And that was their son. So that's why he's called Louis XVIII and not Louis XVII, because that was Louis XVII. But Louis XVIII's there. It's the younger brother of the former king, who, surprisingly, they didn't kill him during the Revolution, which I'm surprised, but they didn't. So he gets back on the throne. And so the Bourbons are back. And then eventually it's more of a constitutional monarchy, though, now. It's not as much of an absolute monarchy, and it will never be again. And so eventually the people advocate in 1830 for a more liberal monarchy, the one that's ruled by the people. And so we get Louis Philippe from the House of Orleans. And he was more for the people. Instead of being called King of France, he wanted his title to be King of the French, to kind of be like, I'm here for the people. And so he was chosen. After him, France decides to create a new constitution, become a republic. And then Napoleon, I think it's his great-nephew or his nephew, Napoleon III comes back, and he creates what's the Second French Empire in 1852. And then in 1870, they end up losing to the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War. And then he gets dethroned, and France becomes a republic for good. And they changed their constitution about 3 more times since then. And so after that, Prussia becomes the dominant force in Europe, and then you get the German Empire, which would then take you to World War I. So kind of some fruit for thought. After the Enlightenment and all these things that happened in France, the French Revolution is such a big deal because it really set the standard for republicanism and just the modern age now in Europe. Because after this, we're going to see a lot of revolutions happen. There's a lot of revolutions that happened in 1848. A lot of countries are going to start to become republics, and a lot of the people in Europe are going to really see the French Revolution as a starting point and kind of like, if France can do this, why can't we do this too? Kind of thing. So it was a huge shift in the politics and the religion within Europe. And that's why the French Revolution's so important. The Enlightenment had been brewing for a while at this point, but I think the French Revolution is really the first prime example of the Enlightenment actually being taken into action. And so that's why we see this here. That's why it's such an important aspect to European history and to world history. And that's kind of why we wanted to talk about it today. Scotty, you got anything else to thought?
And it still influences our society today in ways that we can't see. We can't like immediately see. But everything, all your ideas, everything comes from somewhere. and like our ideas of like, we take like ideas, I see it in pop culture of like, for example, subconscious mind or whatever, things like that, like dream mind or whatever. Like this is an idea that was first coined by Freud. Well, we look at the French Revolution, we have political parties, and we just take that for granted. We have a right and a left party. We literally, that this concept of right and left literally comes from the French Revolution, which now our modern right was the left, and our modern left was the right at the time. But those were the Republicans and what we now call the Democrats. You were literally, as a peasant sitting in the French Revolution, when all of this was happening, all this war was happening, and you had the poor class rise up against the upper class, the person who was representing the bureaucrats that we mentioned that rose up and created the Constitution, these people, we would literally call them, they're the left, sitting in the town hall looking at the two, like, top people sitting representing, they're the left, they're the right, the Republicans on the left, and the Democrats. They probably had a different name for Democrats back then. I don't know what it would have been, something else, the monarch, the king, the upper class, and they called them the left and the right, and we still use those phrases to refer to the left, the Democrats, and the right. Well, now it's switched though, because the sides actually,
that's a whole other
and that's a whole other thing which we won't go into. But these things are, if you look at the French Revolution in retrospect, a lot less deaths than a lot of wars, a lot less, but it's the template for all of the wars that came after. And like you said, it set the stage with Germany being established, the German Empire, with eventually World War I. I would argue that it's impossible to talk about World War I without talking about the Industrial Revolution and without talking about the French Revolution. And so, and that's relevant. I talked about
a little bit at the end of the revolution.
Yeah. What was it? I talked about I will eventually do a video. I'd like to do a video. That'll be far down the road on the American Revolution. That's why I kind of glimpsed at it and briefly mentioned it at the beginning here. But essentially here, and what I argue is really the end of the French Revolution. Napoleon is officially defeated in 1850.
He didn't die in 2025, guys. That's that's a little bit.
Wait, did you do that?
No.
What?
He died 1821, I'm pretty sure.
And so I was like 32 years previously of this exact day that I'm writing these notes, he died. And obviously that was forever ago. Now it's like, so I intended to do.
I didn't realize you had made this far long ago. Wow.
Yeah, I made these. So that's still cool to know. I typed up the notes for the script for this video. I started writing it on May 5th, 2025. And so I was saying on like 3 years. I was like pretty 32, sure 32 years ago of this day he died, which I must have thought that was a crazy coincidence when I was writing the notes. I was like, wow, 32 years ago this exact day, and that just like bled.
I was just reading that he was exiled to St. Helena. He was killed in Waterloo in 2025. Yeah,
that's wrong.
Yeah. He wasn't killed in Waterloo either.
Exactly. That I don't even know what happened.
That's funny.
But
that's funny. Anyway,
no worries. It's fine.
So we got here.
So there we go.
Guess we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, that was it. I mean, I'll be talking about ancient Greece, and I'll be talking about ancient Roman history, and then after that, looking far into the future, I intend on talking about more World War II and World War I stuff. But
and we'll probably do some more collabs too if you guys want to see both of us do another production like this.
Yeah,
this was fun.
And so
present this quote.
I had this like final note because this is not fun. Wars are not good. Wars are not, to say something obvious. And in the words of Edward Gibbon, he said, "History is little more than the register of crimes, follies, and misfortunes of mankind." There's just like something that's like impossible to ignore with like talking about things like this, like with wars, of just like it's something to be avoided. So to say the basic history thing, let's not do this again. Basically, I as somebody who is familiar with history, I'm noticing some tendencies in the West and in America right now in our culture, with politics and some things. I'm not going to name sides because I don't actually think it's a side thing. I think it's happening on all ends of the spectrum with similar tendencies that we saw here with the French Revolution, with a lower class rising up. And it's important to look at history. I think people are ignorant of, for example, Russian history, where we had we have this example here of like the guillotining and all the insanity. We're seeing insanity. We're seeing insanity in politics now. And when I look at, for example, like Russian history, I see we had extreme political movements rise up. And for example, in Soviet Russia, we had a movement to eat the rich. We had a movement to kill the upper class. This is even more extreme than the French Revolution, where they just straight up all of the lower middle class they killed in the name of the upper class. And this resulted in this took what the French Revolution did in like 70 times full. Like not even, no, like we go from, this is like 40,000 deaths to 60 million deaths. We're talking a communist dictator tells the lower class to eat the rich, to kill these upper class people. They call it the kulaks, and 60 million people starved to death because they had no food. And so I urge people to be very careful about political extremism and the path that we're paving for ourselves as a culture. If we take these, and pay attention to the things you say, things like eat the rich, things like and recognize that some things sound nice, but history has taught us that in practice, these things result in massive devastation and travesty. So the French Revolution, in the same way that the Salem witch trials are a really good example of insanity in history, when nobody knows who's right and they put blame, on others, and it causes needless deaths, I emphasize unity. I emphasize that we need to work together to find solutions instead of just going like warrior mode and just like, let's just kill rich people. We need to figure out a solution, and that's going to take us working together and talking about things like the French Revolution.
Yeah. That's why, even though, a lot of history is not, easy to talk about, a lot of it was pretty bad, but that's just where we learn, and that's one of the beauties of it. And it's cool to see all this stuff because with history, you really understand the world better. And I think people that know history are more aware of the world than others who don't. That's why I think it's really one of the most important disciplines of academia that exists. And that's why I'm so fascinated by it. But that's why we want to talk about the French Revolution today. So thank you guys for watching. Be sure to comment, like, subscribe, check out both of our channels. Give us a subscribe. If you want to see some more collabs, let us know in the comments. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.